Welcome and thank you for joining us today at the launch of Natural England's Natural Infrastructure Framework, our principles and standards for England. Today's webinar is a combination of live and pre-recorded material which will be available on YouTube after the event, and the content will be uploaded to Natural England's Green Infrastructure website. Today we're going to hear keynote speeches from Tony Juniper, Chairman of Natural England, and Defra Minister Trudy Harrison. The Green Infrastructure Framework consists of principles, standards, design guide, a mapping tool and guidance on applying these products, all of which you'll hear more about throughout the webinar. We'll also have an informal discussion with Joanna, Averley, Chief Planner for England, and 3 short case study films showcasing green infrastructure in action. The webinar will be, there'll be a live Q&A, and we have Slido running. The QR code is actually on your screen. We welcome your comments and questions in Slido, and please do upvote your top questions, which we'll try to answer at the end of the session. Any questions that the panel don't have time to answer today, we'll compile in a Q&A section in themes and add to the webpage portal for Q&As. We also have a survey poll at the end to collect feedback at the end of the event, so please take time to do that. So what's green infrastructure? Well, many of you will be experts in green infrastructure, but for members of the audience new to the subject, green infrastructure is a network of natural spaces and corridors such as rivers, wetlands or features such as street trees and green roofs that are planned, designed and managed to deliver a range of benefits, including mitigation of flooding, health benefits, improved air and water quality, cooling urban environments, encouraging active travel, walking and cycling, and enhancing biodiversity and ecological resilience, our nature's recovery. Green infrastructure is vital to creating healthier, more climate resilient environments, one property or project at a time through landscape design. The current cost of living crisis and climate emergency brings the value of green space into sharp focus, and we still have a long way to go to address the unequal access to green spaces. Designing good quality green infrastructure is part of the solution, and a GI framework is a comprehensive resource to give practical guidance on how to bring nature back into our cities. From a Landscape Institute's perspective, we've been a champion from the beginning, since our position paper in 2009, subsequent papers and publications, our involvement in the development of the framework. Our members are trained to take a holistic approach to planning and design of development, and are fundamental to delivering high quality, multifunction green infrastructure. The framework promotes a landscape-led approach to master planning. It puts nature to work, fully realising how landscapes can truly work for us by delivering natural solutions. By the end of today's session, you should have a really good overview of the GI framework and hopefully be inspired to create green infrastructure strategies to deliver benefits for your town or city. I'm now going to hand over to Tony Juniper, Chair of Natural England, for keynote speech.
Hello everybody, and welcome to today's launch of Natural England's Green Infrastructure Framework, setting out a series of principles, standards and design guides to help us make the most of what we now understand to be this idea of green infrastructure. Now, the access to green space that many of us enjoy across England, we know, is hugely beneficial for our health and well-being, both in a physical and psychological sense, and a vast body of material has been gathered over a number of years now to underline the importance of nature-rich green and indeed blue areas for the well-being of society. And of course this was underlined for many of us during those dark days of the COVID lockdowns, when many of us found solace in nature when we couldn't see friends and families and do the things that we would normally do, going to events and to the shops and everything else. So we know that this is a really important thing for society, and we also know increasingly how this is something which is not available to everyone. And indeed, amongst the many inequalities that affect our society today is the access that people have, or more importantly don't have, to these wonderful natural assets which can bring so much value at a personal level. And those inequalities in access to green space and blue space are in turn reflected in health inequalities. The two largely overlap. And at the same time as we're looking to create better access and more availability of this essential green infrastructure for everybody, we know that it's bringing many other values besides those for health and how we feel. Amongst them are, of course, our ability to adapt to climate change. We know that not only do we have to do more with the natural environment to be able to remove carbon from the atmosphere and to hold it in ecosystems and in the soil, but also to be able to effectively adapt to climate change. Anyone living in an urban area across much of England last year, and 80% of us do live in urban areas, felt the terrible effects of that prolonged heat wave. For the first time, temperatures going above 40 degrees centigrade. We don't expect that's going to be a one-off. These kinds of extremes are becoming more frequent, and over time we're going to have to build resilience to these kinds of events, and that includes being able to take advantage of nature in reducing the effect of the urban heat island effect. This is something that leads to particularly extreme conditions sometimes in urban areas, and we know that green spaces and trees and water can help ameliorate the effects of that. So putting more green infrastructure in and around our cities is one way in which we can deal with that particular extreme, and also to help cope with some of the extreme rainfall that we've been seeing. And I'm not the only one, I dare say, to notice how a pattern is beginning to emerge with hotter, drier summers and often wetter winters, with sometimes flooding events occurring as a result of that. And again, sustainable drainage facilitated by green infrastructure can be one way to at least reduce the risk of that and take the edge off of some of those disastrous consequences of people's homes and businesses being flooded. So climate change adaptation is right there on top of health and well-being as to why we should be investing more in green infrastructure. On top of that, and the reason I'm not with you today in person is because the government is launching its environmental improvement plan, which will be the roadmap setting out how we're going to make progress towards targets, very stretching targets that have been set for 2030. Targets that are both adopted domestically to halt and then ultimately to reverse species decline, for example, and also embedded in the wonderful global biodiversity framework that was agreed in Montreal at the end of last year, including with very strong British government backing. So that target framework is about nature recovery and the steps we need to make towards nature recovery. And at Natural England, picking up the momentum of the 25-year environment plan, we are now working very hard on the ground across England to build a nature recovery network. And the nature recovery network is not only about the wild places in the uplands, in the coast and in the remote rural areas across the country. This goes from the top of the hills down to the centre of our cities, and it really does need to embrace this question of how we're going to bring nature back towards where most of us live, which is in the urban areas. And if we are going to have the benefits of rich nature enjoyed by many, many more people, then recovering nature, that species abundance and species diversity close to where we live, has a particular premium. So for nature recovery, for climate change and for health and well-being, we can see the real sense of putting some heft and some weight and some ambition behind this idea of the green infrastructure. And of course, if we do this well, it will bring additional benefits on top of all of that in the form of helping to regenerate communities, bringing inward investment, and in the wake of that, helping with levelling up and economic renewal across different parts of England. And so targeting the effort that we have and the different tools that we have, it's going to need a spatial framework. And so the maps and the standards, the principles and the guides that we're producing is really out there to help everybody to make the most of this idea of green infrastructure by being clear about what we mean by it, what good looks like, and then targeting it into the right places. Now, fortunately, we have some new, really quite good tools coming forward that are going to help us to do this. In addition to the rising profile of the science as to why nature's good, for all the reasons I've just said, we now have some additional mechanisms, including biodiversity net gain, which will be an additional resource which we can put into the mix during the coming years, and also a new spatial planning framework in the form of local nature recovery strategies, which will enable us to make good choices through participation of a wide range of different stakeholders to say where we need more green infrastructure and to make sure that it's of the best possible kind. So this is a huge opportunity for everybody to be able to get behind this new agenda and to be thinking about green infrastructure in the kind of strategic way that we think about energy infrastructure, about road and rail and airports and ports, all of these things that we know are essential for the well-being and the development of the country. We now know, because of all the evidence that's been gathered, including by Natural England scientists over many years, that we also need to be putting similar priority behind green infrastructure and investing in it. Because if you think about the challenges that lie before us, they are only going to get bigger as time goes on. We know that a mass extinction of animals and plants is sweeping across the earth. That was the point of the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, to do something about that. We know that we face an intense set of challenges coming from climate change, and that's what the Paris Agreement was all about. And we know that we have a health and well-being crisis on our hands, linked to the rise of various conditions linked to long-term illness, depression, anxiety, heart disease. Now, all of these things can be met through investment in green infrastructure. And when you think of the consequences of not investing in green infrastructure and facing into the consequences of a depleted natural world, runaway climate change, and the health effects that are only going to accumulate unless we take systemic steps to do something about it, not only treating disease but preventing it in the first place, you can see that this is a very cost-effective way of leaning into all of those big challenges. The question is, how do we prioritize it? And then the second question is how do we deliver it? So for the prioritization, the global agreements I mentioned are now matched by a series of domestic commitments. And so we have that. And then the delivery is all about how we get together, build partnerships, and use the different tools that we have to make a difference on the ground. So we have all the good reasons to do this, including the levelling up agenda and in terms of the ambitions we have for the economy into the future. So today is really an opportunity to use this springboard, the new standards, the new principles, the maps and the design guides, to really start embedding green infrastructure across the country in the way that we know makes total sense. So I hope everybody finds today useful and that the tools will be picked up and used in the vigorous way that we hope. And certainly Natural England teams across the country will be standing ready to support partners, including through the work we're doing on the Nature Recovery Network, to match the big ambition that's coming globally, which is reflected in the domestic targets, to actually do things in communities where people live. And hopefully over the years and decades ahead, we will all see a very considerable improvement in the environments that underpin all of our health and well-being. Thank you very much indeed for being here today, and I do hope you find it useful.
Thank you. That was Tony Juniper, Chairman of Natural England. Thank you for setting the scene with that inspiring keynote. Lots to think about there. We now turn to Minister Trudy Harrison, Defra Under Secretary of State, for her keynote.
Hello everybody, what a pleasure it is to be able to speak to you all today at the launch of Natural England's Green Infrastructure Framework. I'm really excited to launch this resource which the government committed to in our 25-year environment plan. This framework will really help local authorities, developers and communities to consider green infrastructure in local plans and in new developments. It will help target investment to deliver really important projects which protect and also enhance our incredibly valuable natural environment. Government has already used the framework's mapping tool to ensure the £9 million Levelling Up Parks Fund reaches areas where it's needed most. This framework will help to deliver real benefits for the 38% of the population who do not currently have access to green space within 15 minutes walk of their homes. I'm really looking forward to seeing the wonderful, well-designed green infrastructure that I'm confident this package of supporting materials will help to foster. Good green infrastructure contributes to both nature and biodiversity recovery, and it helps us to tackle climate change. Our collective experience of COVID-19 reminded us of just how important truly local green space can be in improving our mental and physical health and general well-being. I'm absolutely committed to giving more people opportunities to experience nature regardless of where they live. Experiences like those that I have been lucky enough to enjoy, and my children, where I live in the Lake District. Another of the government's flagship environmental programmes, mandatory biodiversity net gain under the Environment Act, will be implemented later this year, ensuring new developments also help to enhance biodiversity and bring nature closer to people. With national green infrastructure standards and design guidance at their fingertips, I look forward to seeing how our world-leading environmental legislation will be matched by local efforts and innovation to green our villages, towns and cities.
Thank you. That was an encouraging speech from Minister Trudy Harrison from Defra. I'm now going to hand over to Clare Warburton, Principal Advisor for Green Infrastructure, and Jane Houghton, GI Project Manager at Natural England, to introduce the Green Infrastructure Framework.
Thanks, Sue, and it's great to be here with you this morning, introducing the Green Infrastructure Framework. Many of you and your organisations have been on this journey with us, so thank you for all your support. So yes, Jane and I are going to do a bit of a double act. We are from Natural England, the government's advisor on the natural environment. And as you may have noticed today, the government is also launching the Environmental Improvement Plan, and there's some really great support for this package of work in there. So I'm going to kick off things by describing the framework to you and just going to set out why it's needed, its aims, an overview of what's in it, and then our other presenters will build on this as we go through the morning. So what's the context here for the framework? As Tony's highlighted, 80% of people live in urban areas, and the challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss and health inequalities are having significant impacts. And we've heard really clearly from both Tony and Minister Harrison about green infrastructure's important role in tackling these. Added to this, we've got the rising cost of living, which means parks and green space that are free to use are incredibly important. But there are inequalities in access to nature. And surprisingly, our research tells us that a third of us don't actually have access to good quality green space within 15 minutes walk from home. And green infrastructure is often not seen as an essential in designing new places to live. The value of parks and green space is often not taken into account in decision making, and there are significant pressures on local authority budgets, especially for ongoing management. So these are some of the challenges that we set out to address in the framework. So before we move on, what do we mean by green infrastructure? Lots of definitions out there. This one's from the National Planning Policy Framework. It's great, and you can read it when we send around the slides. But I really love this definition that a colleague once said to me, that green infrastructure is simply nature doing a job. I love that. Nature doing its job. It's the everyday nature you see on the way to school, the office, the shops, your local park, your back garden. If you haven't got a back garden, the planters outdoors, the road or rail verge, the wildlife areas, green roofs, green walls, blue infrastructure like canals, rivers, wetlands. And it's doing a job. Actually, nature's a great multitasker. It can metaphorically rub its tummy and pat its head at the same time. So there's a logic chain here, isn't there, around healthier, more resilient nature close to where people live, meaning healthier, more resilient places, helping us to adapt to and reduce climate change, leading to healthier, more resilient people and a healthier, more resilient economy. So we realised as part of the 25-year environment plan that we really needed a framework that would bring all of this together with 4 clear aims: to improve existing and create more good quality green infrastructure for all its benefits, to ensure that everyone has access, particularly in areas of low income and high health inequalities, and to support local authorities in the refresh of their local plans and to mainstream green infrastructure as a key asset in creating and maintaining sustainable and beautiful places. So the framework's designed for planners, for developers, for green space managers and for communities. And other sectors like health, transport, education, where green infrastructure can really help to deliver shared outcomes. So Natural England's got a strong interest in green infrastructure as part of that nature recovery network that Tony was talking about, a single national nature network that delivers benefits for people and wildlife, and that really reaches right from the doorstep to that wider countryside. So with our partners, we set about thinking what impact the framework could have and what change we would really like to see if it was implemented. We want the impact to be that urban areas have more nature, more access to nature close to home, and more benefits from nature for climate, health and prosperity, with a strong Green in 15 ambition for everyone to have access to good quality green and blue space within 15 minutes walk from home, particularly where it's most needed. So what's in the framework? Here's a taster. The pictures are just thumbnails, so don't worry if you can't see those in detail to give a flavour of what's to come. But firstly, there are a few updated tools. So last year we launched the 15 principles of good green infrastructure, and these have had a bit of a mini makeover. I won't go into the details of those today, but they are on the web portal. And then there's the Green Infrastructure Mapping Database, which last year won a Government Geography Award. And today we're launching the next version of this, version 1.2. It's got some really good stuff in it, and Martin Moss will talk about that later. But brand new and shiny for today, and I do feel like we need a bit of a trumpet fanfare for these, actually. There are the 5 headline green infrastructure standards, and Jane's going to talk about those in a moment. They're really significant because they set standards we haven't had before on the quantity and quality of green infrastructure. Also new for today is the Green Infrastructure Planning and Design Guide, a manual for all things green, as one of our directors has described it. And that'll help to put green infrastructure at the heart of mandatory local design codes. And Gary Grant will talk about those in a moment. And finally, the process journeys, simple step-by-step guides on applying the framework. So essentially, we've got an urban greening toolkit, and I'm going to hand over to Jane now to talk us through the first of these new tools, the Green Infrastructure Standards.
Thanks, Claire, and hello, everyone. I'm going to talk through the Green Infrastructure Standards and briefly cover the process journeys. So the standards aim to simplify and clarify what good green infrastructure looks like and how to plan it strategically. They're voluntary standards, and they're based on best practice and evidence. We've developed them working closely with Defra and our cross-government steering group, our advisory group, and with universities and environmental consultancies, and we've tested them with local planning authorities and developers. So the standards are set out in an easy-to-use 3-level structure. At the top are the headline green infrastructure standards, and these are for green infrastructure partnerships to use to undertake initial assessments and develop a vision for green infrastructure and to set local green infrastructure targets. And these standards are led by government. The menu is a more comprehensive but carefully selected range of green infrastructure standards tools, best practice checklists and indicators. And these are owned by a number of different organisations. They can be used with the headline standards for more in-depth green infrastructure planning. And at the bottom is a signposting table, which is a spreadsheet that includes a wide range of these standards and tools to enable users to identify those that are most appropriate for their purpose. So today we're focusing in on the headline green infrastructure standards. This slide introduces the 5 headline green infrastructure standards, and they include a green infrastructure strategy standard, and then standards for accessible green space, urban nature recovery, urban greening factor, and urban tree canopy cover. And each standard distinguishes between the recommended levels of achievement when they're applied at an area-wide scale and for major developments. So I'll talk through the key points in each standard. They're set out in full on our GI website. The Green Infrastructure Strategy Standard supports the National Planning Policy Frameworks policy that local planning authorities should develop strategic policies for green infrastructure in their development plans. And the standard says that at an area-wide scale, local authorities, in partnership with their local communities, should produce both a green infrastructure strategy, or its equivalent, and a delivery plan that can apply the green infrastructure principles and standards locally. And the aim is that these strategies and plans set out how green infrastructure will help to create greener neighbourhoods with a thriving nature network that can reduce air and water pollution, support sustainable drainage, and help places to adapt to climate change. And major developments should have a green infrastructure plan. We've updated the original accessible natural green space standards to include a broader range of accessible green spaces for their health and well-being benefits, while still focusing on accessible natural green space and contact with nature. And the term green space here covers blue spaces as well. At an area-wide scale, the accessible green space standards say that as a minimum, everyone should have access to good quality green spaces within 15 minutes walk from home. And the standards also include size and distance criteria for larger types of green spaces, such as district and country parks. In terms of capacity, there should be at least 3 hectares of green space per 1,000 population. And in terms of quality, we're delighted to include the criteria for the Green Flag Award, which is run by Keep Britain Tidy on behalf of the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And these criteria include accessibility for all to help ensure that everyone can benefit from green spaces. Then for major developments, the local authority specifies the accessible green space to be provided based on the standards. The Urban Nature Recovery Standard will help green infrastructure to contribute to the National Nature Recovery Network in urban areas and help local authorities to deliver their biodiversity duty, local nature recovery strategies and biodiversity net gain. And that says that in urban and urban fringe areas, the proportion of green infrastructure that's managed for nature recovery should be increased by a locally agreed percentage. And there should be an increase in the number and quality of local nature reserves and local wildlife sites. And for major developments, the developer identifies their contribution to nature recovery in their green infrastructure plan. So moving on to the Urban Greening Factors Standard, this aims to increase the level of greening and green infrastructure in developments and in urban environments more widely to improve their resilience, sustainability and biodiversity. And this standard says there should be at least 40% average green cover in urban residential neighbourhoods. For major developments, we've developed a new national urban greening factor, and this is a new type of planning tool which Neal will talk about a little later. And finally, the Urban Tree Canopy Cover Standard, which we've developed with the Forestry Commission, promotes an increase in tree cover for the many benefits that trees can provide in towns and cities. At an area-wide level, local authorities should measure their baseline tree canopy cover and then set a target to increase it by an agreed percentage. And the standard is in this form to respond to the wide variability of tree canopy cover in different places. Major developments should be designed to meet these tree canopy cover targets. We'll also provide additional guidance, such as on planting the right trees in the right places and biosecurity. So, to conclude, the headline GI standards are published today in a report on our Green Infrastructure website. So going on very briefly to the process journeys, these step-by-step best practice guides explain how different stakeholder groups can use the green infrastructure framework and take a strategic approach in applying all the headline green infrastructure standards, principles, etc. There are process journeys for local planning authorities, developers and design teams, and neighbourhood planning groups. So looking forward over the next year, we'll be seeking feedback on the headline standards from stakeholders to see whether and how they should be adjusted to reflect emerging good practice. And we'll develop and publish the menu and signposting table with user guides and training videos, and we'll provide updates through the GI website. So before finishing, I'm delighted to introduce a short film by Allestree Park in Derby, an exciting project that's really starting to show how the accessible green space and urban nature recovery standards can help to create a large nature-rich green space in an urban setting. Thank you.
We're here at Allestree Park in Derby, thinking about our urban rewilding strategy for Derby City, and we're looking at Natural England's green infrastructure framework. Allestree Park is a publicly owned Derby City Council green space, and up until 2020 this park used to be a golf course.
It's used every single day by community groups, and we've got people that walk dogs, that exercise. We had the opportunity to create the UK's largest urban rewilding project, and that sounded incredibly exciting.
Our vision for Allestree Park is to create a nature-rich green space where people and wildlife thrive together.
To make it wilder, provide space for nature to recover, for biodiversity, to reintroduce species that should be there in the park now but aren't, wet landscapes, grassland, trees and other natural habitats. And the other thing I think that we would really like to be able to do is to achieve the accessible green standards. And of course, the opportunity to generate jobs in the green economy.
Green infrastructure standards highlights the vital connectiveness between people and nature, making it very relevant to all sections of society.
We're particularly focusing on urban nature recovery and accessible green spaces.
Derby is the third most densely populated city in the East Midlands, and we saw in the pandemic the importance of green space to local people.
But we also want safe spaces. We want people to actually come to Allestree and feel welcomed and feel like they're represented within the park. We want our volunteering opportunities to be as broad as possible and to make sure that we're encouraging as many people as possible to take part in what is a really exciting project.
We want 1 in 4 people to be mobilised to take action for wildlife, like species reintroduction, citizen science and monitoring.
The climate crisis is with us right here, right now, and Allestree Park provides us the opportunity to respond to that climate crisis in a really, really sustainable, manageable way that will benefit local people. We're not the experts on everything. I think the key thing has been by working in partnership with the likes of Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, with the University of Derby, with Rewilding Britain. They've got some fantastic expertise, capacity, resources.
We've already delivered public consultation through walks, talks and events, and now we're working with individuals and organisations to find out more about how they would use Allestree Park so that we can make a really co-produced programme.
We're igniting a passion for this project. We're finding more and more people are engaging with everything to do with wildlife.
And we want local people and local communities to be involved in engagement projects and wellbeing programmes.
However, we're very aware of the voices that are missing within this project, and we're really doing a lot of work to ensure that our underserved communities are involved in the work that goes into rewilding Allestree Park. We don't have all the answers, but we're reflecting, we're learning, and we're starting the work to enable access for all.
I'm really excited about the opportunities that lie ahead and working with our partners to bring the vision of a rewilded Allestree Park to life.
We're so excited to see what we can do here at Allestree Park and the impact we know it will have for the community.
Hi, thank you. That was such a great film about green infrastructure on such an inspiring scale. We've now got a really good discussion with Joanna Averley, Chief Planner for England, and Edel McGurk at Natural England. So I'm going to hand over to Edel and Joanna.
Thank you, Sue, and welcome, Joanna. It's really great to have you here because I think the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities has been a great advocate for the green infrastructure framework. So to kick us off, how do you see this playing out in planning?
Thanks very much. Just first of all, congratulations. What an amazing day to be both launching the Environment Action Plan, but also the green infrastructure work. It's been building over the last year or so and much more work beyond that and before that. What's so fascinating about planning in the UK and in England in particular is we have a plan-led system, which means, you know, local authorities with their communities should be preparing strategies for their place. And every place is so unique. Every place we live might have more urban, might have more rural, might have a different topography, and will definitely have a unique landscape and ecology. And so what all of the work that's been launched today is doing is giving people the framework for discussion, for proactive planning. And why it's important is we have a plan-led system. So the way that we make decisions about individual interventions, whether that's a project, a major master plan, a new public space, all sit within a planning framework. So I'm just really delighted to see this sort of full suite of material, both the evidence, the mapping, the guidance, the standards, which help people really mobilise behind the agenda.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think there's so much here really in this creation of well-designed, sustainable places that have nature in their heart. How do you see the standards helping with that? How do you, for the different audiences of the framework?
Yeah, well, we've had mention of the of design coding, and for colleagues who are listening in, I'm sure they'll be aware of some of the work that's been done in central government to sort of bring the pursuit of quality and beauty and landscape and good resource management right into the heart of the planning system. So in the summer of 2021, we did a bit of an update to the NPPF, which reflected some of the issues and some of the opportunities we're talking about today. And we also launched something called the National Model Design Code. And that provides a framework for local authorities with their communities to be thinking about what's important in the very character of the place they have now, including landscape and green infrastructure and blue infrastructure, as we know. And then to start to sort of say, okay, well, what are those characters and the essence of the place that we then want to sort of set some standards around? We want to actually set a set of expectation for the change that then comes forward, usually through development and planning applications. And we've been doing quite a lot of work in that space over the last intervening months, including some pathfinders working with local authorities. And what's fascinating and brilliant about the work that's being launched today is it gives that extra richness to the elements in both the National Design Guide and the National Model Design Code that talk about green infrastructure, landscape, health and well-being within our communities, and actually saying, you know, we can start to sort of test development and test our local plans and really pursue some of these issues directly with some really good guidelines.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think just to touch on another part of the toolkit that I know that you've been particularly passionate about, the mapping tool, which I think has probably got great potential around delivering the levelling up ambitions. Would you like to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this goes way back. The first project I ever worked on in 1991, I sat with a computer, piles of paper that deep, which was the London Planning Advisory Service survey of public space in London. And every local authority had to fill in a hard copy survey of each public space. And I sat there doing 1010, doing all the survey entry. So roll on quite a long time later, 30 years later, we now have this capability to map things digitally, to analyse them, to plan digitally. And we're doing huge amounts of work in the national planning system to digitise planning. So we've done, to complement all the work that's been done in green infrastructure, we've got other data coming forward which can be an input to community thinking and to local authorities' work in preparing their plans and the design codes. And it's a really interesting journey. I think the green infrastructure work is almost leading the way in showing how that data can help people both understand and value what they've got, see how they could adapt it. As we've heard, local nature recovery strategy is about joining up that green and blue infrastructure in a meaningful way, and then through positive action in the spaces in between that we need to connect, and then improving the spaces that we've got as well. So all of that richness, we're at a really interesting sort of point where digitisation is really making a difference to how we strategise for places and landscape and community, but equally how communities also engage. So we're doing a lot of work as well within the department in helping local authorities actually use tools to reach out to communities who may not have had a voice before, who may not have been able to sort of engage in the conversation. So a really exciting part of the agenda.
Yeah, I totally agree. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Joanna, and back to you, Sue.
Thank you so much for that insightful discussion. And we now have an overview of the GI mapping tool from Natural England's Martin Moss.
My name is Martin Moss. I'm a senior advisor at Natural England in green infrastructure, and I lead on the development of the England Green Infrastructure Mapping Database. And today we have a short, and I do mean short, taster session launching version 1.2. Connoisseurs of the mapping will know that version 1.1 has been out for about a year. Today we will be launching the first upgrade. So let's have a taste of what's to come. For those who are connoisseurs, this will be old news. For those of you new to the mapping, I think it's important to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. So there are 4 key objectives behind the development of the database. And the first one is to provide a publicly accessible open data green infrastructure mapping resource at an England scale, and to provide common access to data, therefore, across all England. No area from now on has access to less green infrastructure evidence than that provided by this England level database. There are places in England with more data, possibly even better data, but there are places in England where that is not the case. And from now on, this at very least is something that you will have. We're there to provide evidence to support a range of national to local planning, strategy and targeting of resource needs at multiple scales, in particular at an England to local authority level, but data is also provided at more local levels, including multiple and lower super output areas. So it gets down fairly local. I will say, however, the closer you get to the ground, the more the data does need ground truthing. This is a national product, and when it interacts with very local geographies, things can start to go wrong. So we also provide the data as a download. It's capable of being supplemented with local data to match local mapping requirements as needed. So what's it all about? Well, really, it's not just a map or a set of maps for that matter. It's about understanding change. Green infrastructure is not static. It does change over time. That change can be beneficial. It can also be the opposite. We need to understand how that system, how that infrastructure is changing typologically, the sorts of things that we have out there, location and distribution, where it's changing, and how crucially that is affecting people in terms of supply, in terms of demand, inequalities across the country, the performance of the infrastructure, and the overall quality of the spaces that constitute it. So there are 2 key contexts to understand here. Green infrastructure I view as a socio-environmental infrastructure. In other words, it's based on plants, waters and soils, but it's there to do a job for people. So the key question is it doing that job? How do we find out? We have to look at the supply, the distribution and the quality. But underneath that, there's also a need to understand that underpinning ecosystem, the habitat competition, its condition, its diversity, on the basis that a healthy green infrastructure requires a healthy ecosystem in order to work properly. If we've got weaknesses in the ecosystem, we've almost certainly got weaknesses in the infrastructure as well. So version 1.1 was published in December 21. It's been out there for about a year. It brought together about 40 data sets. That's now gone up to about 50, a little bit over 50 in version 1.2. All the content on the website is open government license. It means we can publish it and you can have it as a download. That's crucial to understand because there may be data out there about assets and resources that you think should be here. And the reason they're not might well be because it's not an open data product. So if it's on the website, it's open government license. If it's not, it might not be. The standards website is not a GIS, it's not a geographical information system. It's a presentation, an interactive presentation of the information in the download. So the downloads are available on data.gov in various formats. But the information in those downloads, the actual data itself, is presented on the website in 9 modules. And connoisseurs out there of version 1.1 will be familiar. There are effectively 9 modules, now expanded to about 11. We have information on the basic asset distribution. So green and blue infrastructure asset maps. We've focused on developing an understanding of the accessibility of those publicly accessible assets. We've collated information on linear access networks, in particular the public rights-of-way system. We've developed specific information on blue infrastructure. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, that's all the soggy wet bits, as I call them. So all the water courses, all the water bodies, rivers, canals, lakes, ponds, etc. There is contextual information on designated and defined areas ranging from SSSIs, scheduled monuments through to local authority boundaries. And we have currently 3 modules focusing on inequalities in provision and access to green spaces and natural green spaces, one of which focuses on access to nature close to home, where we're looking at the accessibility of resources to particular population cohorts, in particular children up to the age of 16 and older people 65 years and above. And then 2 specific analyses looking at inequalities in the distribution of assets with respect to either the index of multiple deprivation or population density, and then a range of socioeconomic statistical maps, particularly focused on population data for reference. So what can you do with it? Well, there are a huge range of uses for this sort of data, but it does allow you, for example, to start to understand what assets have I got out there and where are they? It also enables you to start to understand just how green is my neighbourhood, going beyond green spaces and assets to look at all the other green bits and pieces that exist but don't necessarily show up on the asset map. They're too small or it's not open data. We provide information you can start to work out on who's got access to what, within what proximity. So this particular map is showing those places and therefore those communities with some sort of proximity to a green space within about 15 minutes walk, and conversely therefore those that do not. And finally, we can start to see if we look at the inequalities of supply, we can start to ask questions: where do those inequalities matter the most? Where should we get focused our resources, our attention, in order to address a problem? But let's have a look at what's new in 1.2. So there is an awful lot more than we can go through in 10 minutes, but some highlights. We have expanded data on accessible green infrastructure by, for example, adding in information on access points. So we have maps of where the green spaces are, but where can you get into them? If you're interested in journey mapping from origin to destination, then where people go to will be determined by the network of roads and paths around the space, but also the actual points at which you can access them. We've input some information on what we call major barriers. So this is looking at where, even though there is a green space and an attendant buffer around it in terms of proximity and accessibility, the existence of things like motorways, railways and major watercourses can provide significant barriers to access. So we're looking here at places where potentially the access network within the buffer is severed, which means even if you can see the green space, you can't necessarily get there. And we've also started, and it is a start, on collating information about land with permissive access. This is usually private land. It could be wildlife trust land or RSPB land, or it could be owned by private sector organisations, but some form of public access is permitted. We're very interested to build this data. We don't have much at the moment, so a bit of an advert: if you're a landholding organisation and you provide permissive access to at least some of your estate and you'd like it on this map, get in contact. We'd love to talk to you. Likewise with the public rights of way network. Last time we had about 53 gaps in the map where we didn't have data from the constituent highway authorities. We've managed to fill some of those gaps thanks to some local authorities coming forward. I think we're down to about 47 now, but we've still got 47 gaps. That includes inner London, which never had this sort of data, so it's not quite as bad as it sounds. But if you are a highway authority with public rights of way data, particularly the sort of data that we can put in here, vector data, and you'd like to fill your gap, please get in contact. We'd love to talk to you. We have, for 1.2, extracted data from the network information that we have, both for the network and a new density map focused on what are often called the higher rights. So the network that's providing opportunity to do more than simply walk. So the bridleways, the restricted byways and the byways open to all traffic. So that's based on a 5 kilometre square grid, and we can see where the density is higher and where the density is lower, and in fact where there is very little, if any, density at all. And we've moved on. We've focused on creating maps of where the rights of way are, what their status is, what the density is. We're experimenting, I think. This is the first step to put together a public rights of way experiential terrain map. What does that mean? Well, we're trying to map the probable physical characteristics of the route, so not just where it is and what it is, but what's it like when you get there. So explore your local area and see what that says about your access infrastructure. I mentioned the blue infrastructure. We're back with the soggy wet bits. We had extensive content for version 1.1, which we've now expanded. Part of that content was looking at access to waterside across England. The method we used at the time, we knew didn't work very well for urban areas. So we've amended the method and rerun it for what we call the urban mapping domain. So the slide on the left there shows you those lower super output areas, which are urban. They add up to about 20% of England. So the new data is within that 20% of England, and it drills into the urban environment to expose those parts of the blue infrastructure network, which are more likely to be either accessible or not accessible in a way that the previous work could not. And we've undertaken a new inequalities mapping exercise, combining data on green space provision with the linear access network, the public rights of way. So we've created a 5 kilometre grid again across the whole of England, and using various what we call inequalities classes from L1 to H3, identified which class each individual grid square fits within. So key for this map to look at, the L1 represents those areas with least of both, least amount of green space and least amount of public right of way, and H3 represent those places with the most of both. The fact they've got the most of both doesn't mean there aren't any problems. It just means comparatively they appear to be in a better position than other places. So, and finally, very nearly, coming up next, where are we going? Work on version 2, as I've said, has begun, and the first iteration 2.1 is due out just before Christmas this year. We're building significant new content. I'm frequently asked, when are we going to incorporate Census 21? The answer to that question is this year. So version 2 will be based on Census 21 data. Version 1 will be based on Census 2011. So we're resetting the clock from 2011 to Census 21. But we're also building a substantial amount of other functional and topical data and information, some focused on urban functionality and needs, with a particular probable climate change focus. A major project mapping across England at a 5 square metre pixel basis, so 20% of England, which is urban, map for urban habitats and naturalness. Long-term project will have some content, we hope, for the end of this year. That will be focused on assisting decision making for urban nature recovery in particular, and new data, new mapping for health and green infrastructure. You will notice, if you are a connoisseur of version 1.1, that the previous health data has disappeared. That's not because we're not interested, it's because we're doing some major work around health and green infrastructure, hopefully prepared and ready to publish in December. So it only really remains for me to say that the purpose of the green infrastructure mapping is to support the rollout and the launch today of the England Green Infrastructure Standards Framework. It's also part of the Natural Capital and Ecosystems Assessment Programme. I will thank you for listening, and at the final hurdle, I will hand over to the next speaker, Mr. Peter Neal. So Peter, over to you.
Hello. I have been working with Natural England to develop a national urban greening factor that is a key part of the green infrastructure framework. And here is a brief introduction to this new planning tool. So urban greening factors can support the delivery of sustainable development, which is a principal objective of national planning policy. So this includes increasing the provision of green infrastructure to improve the quality of places, creating attractive places that are more biodiverse and better for people, and also places that are more climate resilient to extreme patterns of rainfall and peak summer temperatures. There's been an increasing interest in urban greening factors or green space factors over the past 10 years, and this has grown out of EU-funded research programs led by the Town and Country Planning Association that has published a number of expert papers on the subject. And urban greening factors were first developed in Berlin in the mid-1990s. And so there are 3 core components of urban greening factors. First, there is a target score for urban greening, and it is a proposed target score of 0.3 is used for predominantly commercial development, and a target score of 0.4 for predominantly residential development. Then there are a set of weighted surface cover types that include vegetation, tree planting, green roofs and walls, sustainable urban drainage systems and water features, as well as paved surfaces. And the third component is guidance on where urban greening factors should be applied. It is recommended they are applied to major developments as defined by planning legislation. So the 22 surface cover types are weighted to reflect their functionality and ecological value. And so the higher weightings indicate greater functionality. And each weighting is used to calculate the urban greening factor score. These are listed here. And further detail is provided, including a technical specification for each surface cover type, and also information on how you would go about measuring that particular surface cover type. Here's an illustration of how you might go about calculating an urban greening factor score for a development site. That's a theoretical development site indicated on the diagram on the left, with a building footprint, which may be a residential building, and it includes familiar green infrastructure elements such as wetlands, formal lawns, food growing areas, tree planting, hedge planting, as well as some green roofs, intensive and extensive biodiverse green roofs. And the surface area for each of those is multiplied by the weighting, and the sum of all those figures are then divided by the total site area to give an urban greening factor score. And in this case, this theoretical site creates a score of 0.46, which exceeds a target score of 0.4 for predominantly residential development. And this is very much the process that is used in planning applications. So here, for example, is a planning application for a development scheme in Merton, London. There's a master plan, there's a description and an allocation of different green infrastructure elements. And each of those are calculated with their weightings to establish a UGF or urban greening factor score for the site. And in this case, this scheme scored a 0.54 urban greening factor score. So a user guide has been prepared to explain in more detail how to develop and apply urban greening factors. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm now going to hand over to Ewan Oliver from Lend-Lease to explain how the urban greening factor has been applied at Elephant Park in Southwark, London.
Our vision for the public realm was to create an urban oasis that connects people to place and nature. A livable place where people and businesses can thrive. And our vision was for a place that felt relaxed and naturalistic and welcoming to all. And of course, a place that's also home to nature. Although UGF didn't exist when the project started back in 2013, and wasn't part of our outline planning requirement. Increasingly, planners have asked for UGF assessments to be done on the detailed planning applications that have come forward. And this has really helped to challenge the design teams to increase the quantum and the quality of planting. We have achieved a UGF score of 0.36. In order to reach a good UGF score, we needed to turn the traditional methods of master planning on their head. Instead of saying, where can we fit in green infrastructure? Instead to say, where is it absolutely necessary to have hard infrastructure? UGF has helped to establish some really high value habitats in Elephant Park. Because meadows and trees attract a high score within the UGF calculations, this has encouraged us to increase the number of trees and also meadow areas. And of course this links back to creating a place where people can be in contact with nature. Natural England's GI framework is crucial if we're to tackle the big issues of the 21st century. It clearly sets out the guidance to deliver good quality schemes, and I think that generally if you give developers a set of well-defined parameters to work to, they will deliver what's required.
Now we're going to hear more about designing good quality green infrastructure, and I'm going to hand over to consultant Gary Grant for an overview of the Green Infrastructure Planning and Design Guide.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here live. I'm going to give you a very, very quick overview of the guidance document. I'm very excited because this morning I've got the best ever slide changing device, so hopefully everything goes really well. So there's just a few slides. I've got 8 minutes in total to very quickly run through this, but of course you'll be able to look at it in more detail when you download the document. So the guidance is there to inspire the creation of healthier, nature-rich, climate-resilient, thriving places where people not only live and go to school and college, but also work and play. It's written for local authority planners, but it's also going to be very useful for landscape architects, urban designers, green space managers, and frankly anyone wanting to bring more soil, water and vegetation and nature into their neighbourhood. So the design guide will support local authorities to develop their own design codes for green infrastructure, and it will complement the National Design Guide and the National Model Design Code, which we've already heard about from Joanna. So it will also provide the evidence for the benefits and the functionality provided by green infrastructure. So there are plenty of links in there, and it's a very practical guide which will give the advice that you need and the leads if you need further detail. And as we've already heard, there's very strong links with the green infrastructure framework, the principles and the standards. So you can cross-reference that. And also, again, it's important to note that this is complementing and mirroring the National Design Guide's 10 characteristics of well-designed places. So there's very good integration there with these other initiatives. So the guidance takes into account biodiversity net gain. You've already heard about that. Urban greening factor, you've heard about that from Peter, and the local nature recovery strategies. It's landscape-led with a focus on landscape character, local distinctiveness, and of course we've had advice from all kinds of experts, geologists, heritage experts, and others. So it's a very rounded approach. So one of the chapters is looking at the building, what we're calling the building blocks of green infrastructure networks, from sustainable drainage, green roofs, green walls, and so on, through to trees in hard landscapes, and then some of the more better known features, allotments, orchards, and parks, natural spaces, heritage features, and blue spaces. So we look at each of those building blocks in turn, looking at the issues and opportunities. For example, you've got sustainable drainage systems, and of course we're very pleased now that Defra have just announced that they will be looking to implement Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act. So this really will be something that all of us will be thinking about in the future. And then just very briefly, you know, we've got information on, for instance here, features for species, bird boxes, nest roosting boxes, features for invertebrates. Another example, traffic-free routes. How do you go about integrating that into your green infrastructure network? And also, it's important to reiterate that green infrastructure is there about multiple benefits. So there are links back to all the different functions and then how each area you know, can bring about those benefits. It does vary from area to area. Good example of that, urban cooling. You already heard about that from Tony. And so for each of these, there's a summary, there's some excellent diagrams, and it will, again, as I say, link you to the evidence of how, you know, in this case, how you're getting evaporative cooling and shade in heat waves from green infrastructure. Onto the area types. These really mirror what is provided by the National Model Design Code. So we're going from the centre of cities through to the rural areas, and then there are one or two specialist land uses which are looked at as well. So for instance, the high streets are here. We're going to have greener high streets, more trees, sustainable drainage, and so on. So there's lots of ideas about that. The urban core, where we're going to see a lot more vegetation on buildings, for example. And for each of these, there are links back to the standards so that you can see how those would be applied in each case. So that's a very useful feature of the guidance. And then we've worked with people in the Department of Education and others to look at particular land use types. So here, for instance, you've got a typical education campus. So there's thoughts about how you go about greening those and maximizing the benefits that you get from green infrastructure. So plenty to dig into there. And then finally, there are case studies. This particular example is Minster Park in Sunderland. And for each case study, again, there are links back to the standards, so you can see how they were applied or if they were applied. And the case studies are on the website, and I understand that they will grow in number. So that will be a terrific resource and one that you'll probably want to go back to. And then finally, that's it for a quick look at the guidance, but I'm just going to introduce a short film which is about Mayfield Park in Manchester, which I think really is an inspirational example.
Natural England's GI standards will provide critical guidance to the public and private sector with real-life examples such as Mayfield. Mayfield is a massive regeneration project that was working with some heavily contaminated land, and it now puts people, place and nature at its heart. Mayfield has contributed to Manchester's green infrastructure agenda by delivering one of the first city centre parks in almost over 100 years. Mayfield Park is 2.6 hectares of high quality green space, play space and of course ecological habitat.
This new green space is different because, guess what? It's a landscape-led approach. And this is an approach that we hope is going to be copied elsewhere in the city. What's also different is the creative and innovative design features that have been factored in, not just the great amazing stuff that's on top of the surface but below ground as well, making the site really adaptable to the extreme conditions of climate change that it might face, in particular flooding. This place will have a real impact on people and nature because it's free, it's accessible, it's interesting, and it's a minute's walk from Manchester's main train station. I think if we were to stumble across this in any other European city, we'd be absolutely thrilled. Yeah, it's a special place, and nature's in the heart of the city, which I think is going to stimulate investment.
Mayfield will benefit people and nature in tandem. It will put nature right on the doorstep of so many of Manchester's residents. Mayfield is contributing to tree canopy cover with 156 new trees. Following the opening of the park in September 2022, Mayfield Partnership definitely plans to apply for a Green Flag Award.
Why have a green infrastructure strategy? I'm a policy officer, so I'm slightly biased, but a strategy or a plan is a rallying point. It's a rallying call. It allows you to look at where you are, where you're going and how you're going to get there. And I think that's really, really important, is establishing that long-term vision alongside helpful and useful environmental evidence, such as the green infrastructure standards. We have the cause, we've got climate emergency and ecological emergency. What the plans allow us to do really is turn those strategies and policies into practical action on the ground, and Mayfield is a great example of this.
Mayfield could of course be done in other places. What you need to deliver something like Mayfield is partnership working, intensive collaboration and a vision that everyone can get behind. These standards could also help local authorities emphasise where opportunities for GI exist and how to exploit them.
And the thing is, here in Manchester, we'd like to think that if the world's first industrial city can apply these principles and develop more climate resilient approaches, then we can all do it.
Hi and welcome back. What a great achievement at Mayfield. So now we'll have time for our Q&A panel. So thank you all for your questions that's been coming in thick and fast on Slido. And I welcome our panellists, Chief Planner Joanna from Edel, Natural England's McGurk, Clare Warburton, and consultants Peter Neal and Gary Grant, who we've heard from already today. So I'm just going to get the Q&A panel started off with a question of my own to Joanna. So as a voluntary mechanism, how can the green infrastructure framework affect change?
Thanks. Well, I think we sort of partially addressed this in the conversation we were having earlier on. The Green Infrastructure Framework basically sets the basis on which communities and councils can start to really look at how they plan for green infrastructure. And once you've put something into a local plan, that then forms the basis for making decisions, and that's on individual planning applications. Communities can also use it when preparing neighbourhood plans, and developers should see it as a way of really sort of grasping the nettle, dare I say it, and actually starting to sort of think about how they design not just the homes that we need, but the environments that we need as well.
Thank you, Joanna. That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And what we've done with the Slido questions is that we've pulled together a kind of top 10. So what I'd like to do now is take a question from about Deluc addressing the loss of front gardens to hard surfacing. And even the National Infrastructure Commission now sees the hidden issue in flood risk. So let's have a conversation a little bit about the front gardens and sort of aspects about permeability. Can I ask Joanna to take that one? Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you. I had a visit to Cambridge recently, and I'm sure many colleagues have visited or seen Marmalade Lane as a project. And what's fascinating is that was a community-led development with a very conscientious developer and design-led solutions. And through challenging, actually, space for the car versus spaces for nature and people and green space, it completely turned on its head the layout of that block of Cambridge. And you don't have to go very far from there to see housing layouts that are actually as much about the car as they are the individual and the home and landscape and the garden and nature. So I think what has been set out in the framework is a way of challenging ourselves to make the right choices for when you design a new place. And then when it comes to our own homes, our own environments, our own neighbourhoods that are already existing and we're managing and we're changing and we're adapting, I think what's so fascinating about all this work is it helps us challenge ourselves actually about the decisions we make. And in a sense, it's giving us all as communities and as a society a framework to sort of say, how do we progressively pursue biodiversity net gain, local nature recovery, the quality of our natural and our ecological environment, and how can it benefit our lives? And we might then change our choices as to how we change our own immediate environments.
Thank you, Joanna. I think also, Peter, you might have something to add there about urban greening factor.
I think the focus of the question is about sealing our cities, and trying to increase permeability is absolutely at the heart of the urban greening factor, where it's looking to try and open up our hard surfaces and turn them into much more green and permeable surfaces. So it'll be much more resilient on surface water management, particularly with the impact of climate change.
Thank you, Peter. There's another question here, which I think is going to be really interesting for us to sort of cover off. And hopefully we'll get conversation going around that one. But the success of good quality green infrastructure requires a great long-term stewardship. Will funding be available for local authorities to deliver, or what are the other mechanisms that we're going to have to deliver long-term stewardship? Edel, can I ask you to sort of pick that one up?
Yes, thank you, Sue. So I think this is a really interesting one, and the person who's asked the question is absolutely spot on. Green spaces do, and green infrastructure generally does need looking after. We see multiple elements coming together around this. So we've got biodiversity net gain coming in through the Environment Act, would come mandatory later this year. And that provides a great opportunity around funding the management of, particularly of existing green spaces if it's used creatively. And then we also have the kind of like, you know, what happens through planning, through developer contributions for shaping and setting up the management of new green spaces into the longer term. I think it's also worth just picking up the importance of the community role in stewardship. It's been shown time and again that that how involving communities in that kind of activity has just got multiple benefits in terms of health and well-being, and you know, our work with Department of Health and Social Care around green social prescribing has really shown the benefits that can come from you know, in terms of health, but also social cohesion. Through engaging that voluntary effort in looking after these places.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I add to that?
Yeah, of course you can.
Just to build on that, some of the work that has been done through the Future Parks Accelerator, for example, has really shown us how, you know, there are new ways of bringing green finance in here, and looking at things like, you know, water companies investing in sustainable drainage systems, for example, business improvement districts, and looking at, as Edel mentioned, biodiversity net gain. You know, parks and green space managers looking to potentially sell biodiversity units, provide that uplift in biodiversity and benefit from that 30-year management tail. So there's some really, I think there's some game-changing opportunities actually arising here. So yeah, but one to, I think, to work on with us over the next few years.
Just something to sort of, again, point a little bit to Joanna here as well. but there's funding in terms of the cash, and then there's resources. But I think one thing that LI have just done fairly recently is a skills survey, and we've recognised that skills are actually at a real premium. And so what are we going to be doing? How are we going to be looking at that? And I think through levelling up and Office of Place, there's aspects, isn't there, around getting the requisite skills that we need in local authorities and in the community.
Yeah, and I think it's something that we're very conscious of, and the government are very conscious of, which is we are, as a society and as a country, we are facing sort of new challenges, and those challenges actually are there's sort of multiple sets of issues sort of playing out, and we have to address them in a very sort of multidisciplinary way. And local government also are sort of starting to absorb what that change means for them. And it's incumbent on all of us, whether it's professional bodies, arm's length bodies and statutory consultees, government themselves, and local government to sort of support that change process. So the work being announced today is part of putting that sort of know-how into the industry for all to be able to use. But also, I think we will all be collectively working on how we continue to sort of provide skills and capacity into local authorities and to communities so they can really sort of help deliver on this agenda over the coming years. So it's a very active part. It's not just about guidance and policy and putting it into the system, but actually supporting those who then will be on the delivery end of it as well.
Thanks, Joanna. I think just leading on to that, from that rather, question here about will there be guidance and advice for how to use the GI framework to underpin local plan policies? And I think that's something for all of us to sort of answer, I think, from a private sector perspective, from a consultancy perspective, from a membership organisation perspective, government and NGO. But who'd like to kick off on that one?
Yes, I'll kick off, thanks Sue. So yes, one of the process journeys is specifically designed for local authorities. So the local authority process journey takes you through the step-by-step sort of approach to applying the framework. So that's the starting point. But really, as Joanna was saying, it's about sort of taking those national standards, applying them locally, setting them up in local plan policies and development requirements, and then seeing them through in that sort of local context. We will also be providing some training for local authorities. So colleagues have already been working with sort of organisations like the Planning Advisory Service to roll out sort of programmes of training around biodiversity net gain. And this coming year, we're looking at how we can develop an integrated package that will start to bring green infrastructure framework, biodiversity net gain and local nature recovery strategies into one sort of training package, so we can really start to work out how we can get the most out of these tools for everyone's benefit.
Great, thank you. And just with the couple of minutes that we've got left, I just wonder if Gary and Peter could talk also about, from a kind of consultancy, from a kind of practitioner's perspective, about how we can support our local communities, local authorities to sort of use these tools to the best of their abilities. Have you got reflections?
You start, Gary, and then I'll continue.
Yeah. So I think there's big opportunities here to emphasise the nurture of green infrastructure, creation of jobs, training programmes, particular projects where, for instance, there's renewal of housing and so on, and that can be tied into training on these issues, as well as creating jobs. So I see this as a big opportunity. I know there are tough times, but people really do want to get involved in this. So I know that there are a lot of people out there, a lot of partners that want to invest in that side of things. What we're calling nurture, not just maintenance sounds like a problem. Nurture is a very positive thing. So it's not just creating this sponge city, if you like, which is how I like to characterize all of this stuff. It's how do we look after it? And lots of opportunities.
And I think, it'll take time, I think, for people to unpack all of the material that is being presented today. There's a whole wealth of guidance and good practice and case studies included into this. But with Jane's presentation earlier this morning, there are the headline standards, then there is the menu, and then there is the signposting. So there is, I think, a very clear framework to navigate through. And then with the process standards, Claire's already mentioned guidance for local planning authorities, but there's also the process journeys for developers and design teams, and also for community groups through neighbourhood forums. So I think there is a lot of guidance and additional training that will help you navigate and then implement the standards going forwards.
Great, thank you, Peter. And just other thing that occurs to me is that there's a lot of guidance out there, and I mean, I absolutely celebrate, endorse, and you know, 3 cheers for Natural England today and the launch of this tool. But how are we going to help our audiences navigate the sort of wealth of materials that are now out there? And do we have any plans for sort of somehow sort of integrating or sort of pulling some of those things together? I'm going to ask you, Jen, because you can look at that one.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, really, we are looking at that kind of integrated training package that will start to bring together these different threads. You know, biodiversity net gain, local nature recovery strategies, they will be mandatory requirements. And we need to provide that. That training so that people really understand how these approaches can be applied in practice, and that's the step, isn't it, from theoretical into you know, practical on the ground, how this stuff can be done, and that will take some time. But you know, I think actually some of these mechanisms are potentially game changing. As I said, you know, biodiversity net gain potentially, you know, Plymouth, for example, is really showing the way as how you can do urban habitat banks, for example. So there's some really good practice out there we can learn from, and in our frequently asked questions that we will have on the web portal, we'll be directing you to, you know, to other places that are doing this stuff. So we can, I think it's that kind of co-learning as well, isn't it? And having those networks where we can share good practice and really learn from each other, because we haven't got all the answers, and actually applying this in a place is going to be where we really do start to see how this stuff all comes together.
Yeah, I totally agree. You've got to see it and feel it and experience it. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think just what Claire said at the end is the really important bit, that this stuff happens in places, and when you look at, you know, whether it's a parish or a town or region or a district, you know, that's when you start to see the kind of the environmental opportunities and pressures come together. So yeah, definitely a point worth emphasising, I think.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're kind of at a close to our sort of Q&As. So it just remains for me to sort of say thank you to the panel for that Q&A session. I hope you're going to find that helpful. And as previously stated, we're going to sort of capture some of those questions and put them on the web pages. I'm now going to hand over to Amanda Craig, Director of People and Nature at Natural England, for some closing remarks. So over to you, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Sue. And what a momentous day, actually, really, for us all to be here, with coinciding with the launch of the government's environmental improvement plan. This really is an amazing piece of work, and it's several years in the making, but very much truly a partnership piece of work. And I'm so delighted that we have been joined today by a number of our partners who've been working so closely with us on it, and including showcasing through all the films that we've seen today, which is absolutely fabulous. Over 230 local councils have actually declared a climate emergency, which we know is very much linked with the decline in biodiversity. And if you only manage to read one document from today, given the wealth of guidance, I would really recommend the design guide. It's an amazing piece of work, and really has been described today through the presenters as a manual for all things green. That's the best way to be able to describe it. Really to be able to help planners, developers, land managers and communities to put nature, climate and the well-being of their communities right into the heart of where people live. As Clare has said, this is about nature doing its job, basically. Today, though, we've heard from our great speakers just about the importance of strategic planning being really seriously a galvanising force that we've heard very much from Dave. The essential nature being able to work in partnerships as well to get this to happen. Mayfield example is fantastic, showcasing that. And the importance of local community engagement for people to feel welcomed and part of it. And I've had the pleasure of going out to see Allestree Park myself as well, and that is an amazing piece of community engagement. And as Martin talked us through with the GI mapping tool, that is absolutely fantastic and is really helping us to be able to identify those areas with high need. But it's also going to help us to track progress as well with all of this. And as Joanna said, this is really leading the way in terms of digitisation, making a real difference to how we can actually see how this is going to work. So from Natural England's perspective, we're really looking forward to working with our partners to be able to embed this framework across towns, villages, cities, neighbourhoods. We're going to be able to provide training for local authorities, developers, land managers and communities to just really help embed this into local strategies. So what I'd also say is take a look at the resources tab that's on the web portal, sign up to that. We're going to be providing all of the material from today onto that as well, so you can capture that in your own time. And we'd also really like to know how this is going as well, so to pick up case studies from you, tell us how the framework is working, how it supports your work, how you've actually applied it, and any of the challenges that are kind of arising from it. And I suppose just as a kind of final sort of reflection from what is kind of a momentous day really in terms of everything that's happening today, it really is the time now to act, for us to act. We do want to be able to create a future where nature is on the doorstep for everyone, within 15 minutes of where people live, and for actually to be able to raise the next generation that can love and care for nature because they can find it, because they can access it, and because they can experience it close to where they live. This is really going to help us to create climate resilient towns and cities and help improve the well-being of all of our lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for fantastic closing remarks there. And it just reminds me to say thank you to everybody that's contributed to the event today, to our amazing panellists, to all the Natural England people behind the scenes for making it go really smoothly. Thank you to everybody that's contributed over the last few years to sort of creating the framework. Lots of volunteer support there and help going into that. So we couldn't have done that without you all. And thank you to everybody that's joined online today. Please do explore the material further at Natural England web portal. And also please remember the survey that you're going to come up, because obviously sort of that helps everybody sort of create better product and better content in the future. So thank you so much from me, and thank you from everybody else here. Hope you have a great day, and see you all soon.